I Married a Billionaire Beaver by Joan Savage. Chapter 1. The Billionaire Beaver. The first thing Emily Carter heard on the morning that would change her entire life was her neighbor Dolores Pittman shouting across the street. "He's back! The Billionaire Beaver is back, and Lord help us all!" Emily paused on her front porch, coffee mug halfway to her lips, and watched Dolores sprint down Maple Avenue in house slippers, waving her arms like she was directing air traffic. For a 67-year-old woman with a bad hip, Dolores moved with impressive urgency. "The beaver!" Dolores hollered again, disappearing around the corner. Emily sipped her coffee. This was Heron Falls, Tennessee. Population 4,200. And apparently, the beaver had returned. His name was Mason Beaver. That was simply a fact. Like the river was wide and the summers were merciless. His grandfather had built half the original town. His father had built the other half. And Mason himself, before he'd left at 22, with nothing but a beat-up pickup truck, and what people described as a look of terrifying determination, had grown up right here on the same streets that Emily now taught children to read on. He'd sold his construction company 3 years ago for a number so large that the local newspaper, the Heron Falls Gazette, had printed it wrong twice. The correction had been almost more impressive than the original figure. And now, according to Dolores Pittman and approximately 40 other residents who were currently rushing past Emily's front porch in a state of communal excitement, Mason Beaver had come home. Emily set down her coffee. She had a school board meeting in 2 hours, and the news she was bringing was not good. The Heron Falls elementary roof had been leaking since March. The historic Riverside District, 12 blocks of 19th-century brick storefronts and the oldest working grist mill in the state, was being eyed by a development company out of Nashville that wanted to tear everything down and build condominiums. The town's operating budget had a gap in it that the mayor described as significant, and that Emily's friend, town accountant Patrice Webb, described as catastrophic. Emily walked back inside, poured the rest of her coffee into a travel mug, grabbed her bag, and headed toward the commotion. She found Mason Beaver standing in front of the old hardware store on River Street, studying the building the way a surgeon studies a patient. He was taller than she remembered, though she'd only seen him from a distance before, back when she was a teenager, and he was already a legend. He wore dark jeans and a gray flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his arms were crossed over his chest in a way that suggested the building had personally offended him. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been designed by someone with strong opinions about jaw design, and an expression so thoroughly unreadable that 3 different people on the sidewalk were whispering to each other as if he couldn't hear them. "Do you think he's going to buy it?" whispered Carl Briggs, who owned the bait shop 2 doors down. "He bought the old mill last week," whispered someone else. "He bought the mill?" whispered a third person. "He bought the mill, the old ferry dock, and the Whitmore property out on Route 9. What does a beaver do with a ferry dock?" "Carl, his name is Beaver. He's not actually—" "I know what he is, Linda. His name—" Emily stood at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered at a respectful distance from Mason, watching him study the hardware store with those dark, serious eyes. She was a reasonable person. She believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. She believed in grace and humor and the fundamental decency of human beings. She also believed that whatever Mason Beaver was planning to do to this town, someone should probably ask him directly. She stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said. Mason Beaver turned and looked at her. The crowd behind her went extremely quiet. "I'm Emily Carter," she said. "I teach 3rd grade at Heron Falls Elementary. I'm also on the Riverside Historical Preservation Committee, which is a committee that exists because we're desperately trying to keep someone from tearing all of this down." She gestured at the street around them. "Are you planning to tear any of this down?" Mason Beaver looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried and carried the faint remnant of a Tennessee accent he'd never fully lost. "Are you planning to build anything?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "What?" He looked back at the hardware store. "I haven't decided yet." Emily nodded slowly. "Okay, well, when you decide, I'd love to hear about it. We have a historical committee meeting every second Thursday. You're welcome to come." Mason looked at her again. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. It might have been surprise. It might have been something else entirely. "I'll think about it," he said. Emily smiled. "Great." She turned to the crowd. "You can all go home now. He's not a bear. He's just a man." "He's the Billionaire Beaver," Dolores Pittman said firmly from the back. Mason Beaver looked past Emily at the crowd and then looked back at Emily. "Does that happen a lot?" he asked. "Welcome home," Emily said pleasantly and walked away. She heard, faintly behind her, what might have been the beginning of a laugh. But when she glanced back, his expression was perfectly composed again, and he had returned to studying the hardware store. Chapter 2. The Crazy Proposal. The school board meeting lasted 2.5 hours and ended with Emily feeling like she'd been hit by a truck made entirely of bad news. The roof repair estimate was $400,000. The state funding they'd been counting on had been redirected. The Riverside District purchase offer from the Nashville Development Company, Meridian Holdings, was real. It was large, and the town council had 30 days to present a counter-proposal, or the historic properties would go to auction. "What does a counter-proposal even look like?" Emily asked Patrice afterward, sitting across from her at the Bluebird Diner. Patrice, a practical woman who wore reading glasses on a chain and never sugar-coated anything, stirred her iced tea and said, "About $3 million. Emily stared at her. "At minimum," Patrice added. "Where does a town of 4,000 people find $3 million in 30 days? "That," Patrice said, "is an excellent question." They sat with the silence of it for a moment. Through the diner window, Emily could see River Street, golden in the late afternoon light, the old brick storefronts casting long shadows, the oak trees that had stood there since before either of their grandmothers was born. "What about the beaver?" Patrice said. Emily blinked. "What about him?" "He's a billionaire, Em. He's back in town. He's already buying properties. Maybe He'd what? Just donate $3 million to the town? People don't do that." "He bought the mill," Patrice said. "He didn't have to do that. The mill was going to be torn down." Emily thought about Mason Beaver standing on River Street, studying the hardware store with those serious eyes. He'd said he wasn't going to tear anything down. He'd said he was going to build something. "I'll think about it," she said, which was almost exactly what Mason had said to her, and she did think about it, all the way home and through dinner and into the following morning. She did not expect Mason Beaver to call her. He called her at 8:15 on a Tuesday. She was in the middle of explaining fractions to 22 8-year-olds when her phone buzzed in her cardigan pocket. She stepped into the hallway, saw an unfamiliar number with a Tennessee area code, and answered. "Emily Carter." "This is Mason Beaver." She pressed her back against the hallway wall. "How did you get this number?" "Patrice Webb." Emily made a mental note to have words with Patrice. "Okay, what can I do for you?" "I have a proposal," Mason said. "I'd like to meet with you. Tonight, if possible." "What kind of proposal?" "The kind that needs to be discussed in person." Emily looked through the small window in her classroom door. Her students were, improbably, still working on their fraction worksheets. 6 o'clock? She said. Bluebird Diner. Somewhere private, Mason said. She paused. You want to have a private meeting with the elementary school teacher? Yes. That's going to cause an enormous amount of town gossip, Mr. Beaver. There was a brief silence. I'm aware, he said. I'm willing to accept that. She sighed. Fine. My house. 6 o'clock. Do you know where I live? Patrice gave me your address. Of course she did. She went back into her classroom. 22 children looked up at her with the specific curiosity of 8-year-olds who know something interesting just happened. Who was that, Miss Carter? Asked Jalen, who had never once in his life minded his own business. A man named Beaver, Emily said, and returned to the lesson. The resulting chaos took 11 minutes to settle. Mason Beaver arrived at her house at exactly 6 o'clock, carrying nothing, wearing the same dark jeans and flannel shirt combination she'd seen before, and looking deeply uncomfortable in the way of a person who doesn't spend much time in other people's homes. Emily had made coffee. She offered it. He accepted. They sat at her kitchen table, which was covered in student artwork and the detritus of a working teacher's life, and Mason looked around with the expression of someone recalibrating their expectations. You have a lot of paper fish on your wall, he said. We studied rivers last month. She wrapped her hands around her mug. What's the proposal, Mr. Beaver? He looked at her steadily. How much do you know about the Riverside District situation? Enough. Meridian Holdings. 30 days. 3 million minimum. He nodded. I've been looking at Heron Falls since January. The town is financially distressed. The infrastructure is deteriorating. The school is underfunded. But the bones are extraordinary. The river is extraordinary. The historic district, if restored properly, could anchor a tourism economy that would sustain this town for the next 100 years. Emily listened. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see her garden, still and golden in the evening light. I want to invest in Heron Falls, Mason said. Significantly, the Riverside District, the school roof, the community center on Oak Street, the old ferry dock, and 4 or 5 other projects that I think would transform what this town can offer. Emily's heart was beating strangely. How much are we talking? 8 million to start, he said, with more available as projects develop. The kitchen was very quiet. To start? She repeated. Yes. And what do you want in return? She asked, because there was always something. Mason Beaver looked at her with those dark, serious eyes and said, I want you to marry me. Emily put down her coffee mug very carefully. I'm sorry, she said. A temporary marriage, he said, as if this clarification made it entirely reasonable. A year, possibly 18 months. Mr. Beaver? I have a situation with a trust fund, he said. My grandfather set up a significant family trust that releases a substantial secondary holding on the condition that I am married. I've spent years not particularly caring about the trust, but the holding in question would allow me to fund not just Heron Falls, but the restoration of 3 other towns in this region that are in similar situations. Emily stared at him. You want to marry me so you can access more money to restore small towns? Yes. That is the most complicated philanthropic strategy I have ever heard. Something moved in his expression. It's not entirely philanthropic, he said. The restored Riverside District would be a significant asset. My investment returns would be... I don't care about your investment returns, Emily said. I care about the part where you're asking me to marry you. We met 2 days ago. You said 7 words to me on River Street. I'm not asking for a real marriage, he said. I'm asking for a legal contract with a clearly defined end date. You would live your own life. I would live mine. We would appear together at necessary functions. At the end of the term, we would file for divorce, and you would receive a financial settlement that I have not yet determined, but that would be generous by any definition. Where would we live? She asked, and then immediately added, Not that I'm considering this. I bought the Calloway house, he said. Emily blinked. The Calloway house was the enormous Victorian on the hill above the river, the one that had been empty for 6 years, the one that every child in Heron Falls believed was haunted, and every adult privately also believed was haunted. Of course you bought the haunted house, she said. It's not haunted, he said. It needs work. Mr. Beaver, Emily said carefully, I'm a third-grade teacher. I'm not a business arrangement. I know, he said. That's why I'm asking you. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means, he said slowly, like the words were being extracted from somewhere difficult, that you're the only person in this town who looked at me like a person and not a transaction. And I think that matters. For what I'm proposing to work, it needs to look real. Real enough that a trust administrator in Nashville is convinced. And, he paused, and I'd prefer to do this with someone I don't have to pretend to tolerate. Emily was quiet for a long moment. I need to think about this, she said. Of course, he said. I need to talk to Patrice. I expected that. And possibly my mother. I'll give you 48 hours, he said. He stood up, picked up his coffee, finished it in one swallow like it was a shot of something stronger, and set the mug on the counter. Thank you for the coffee. Mr. Beaver? Emily said. He turned at the kitchen doorway. If I say yes, she said, and I'm not saying I am, I have conditions. Name them, he said. The school roof gets fixed first, before anything else. He looked at her for a moment. Agreed, he said. He left. Emily sat at her kitchen table for a long time, surrounded by paper fish, listening to the river. Chapter 3. Married for the Town. She said yes. She said yes after 48 hours of conversations with Patrice. Are you insane? Probably, okay, but is the settlement in writing? No, a phone call with her mother that went in approximately 17 different directions, and a long walk along the river at sunrise, where she stood on the old ferry dock and looked at the crumbling storefronts on the opposite bank, and thought about the first time her grandmother had walked her through the Riverside district and told her this was worth saving. She said yes with a list of 11 conditions, which Mason accepted with minimal negotiation, and on a Wednesday morning in early June, Emily Carter and Mason Beaver were married at the Heron County Courthouse in a ceremony attended by a board clerk, Patrice Webb, who cried, which surprised everyone including Patrice, and Dolores Pittman, who had somehow found out and shown up uninvited with a small bouquet of flowers from her garden. For the Beaver, Dolores said, pressing the flowers into Emily's hands. He's my husband now, Dolores. You can probably call him Mason. I will call him what I've always called him, Dolores said firmly, and straightened Emily's dress collar with the authority of a woman who has attended many weddings. The ceremony lasted 4 minutes. The clerk mispronounced Mason's last name, which had never happened before, and which Mason bore with remarkable composure. Emily signed her name next to his, and when she looked at what she'd written, Emily Beaver, she felt the particular internal collapse of a person who has made a decision they cannot unmake. She looked up at Mason. He was watching her. You okay? He said, quietly enough that only she could hear. Peachy, she said. Something that might have been a smile passed across his face. They moved into the Calloway house that weekend. It was, as Emily had suspected and Mason had denied, extremely haunted looking. It was also, as she discovered once she was actually inside, breathtakingly beautiful. 12 rooms, original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch that overlooked the river, and a kitchen with stone counters and a farmhouse sink that made Emily stop in the doorway and say something that was not suitable for the classroom. "I know," Mason said. "That's the good kitchen." "There's another kitchen?" "There's a service kitchen. I don't use it." "How many rooms is this house?" 12. "That's too many rooms for 2 people, Mason." It was the first time she'd used his first name. He seemed to notice. "I know," he said. "That's why I was thinking of turning the East Wing into a community space eventually. Meeting rooms, something the town can use." Emily looked at him. "You already plan to do that?" "It's a resource," he said. "Resources should be used." She picked up her box and carried it toward the stairs. "You know," she said, "most people buy a house and think about what color to paint the living room." "I know what color I'm painting it," he said. "What color?" "I haven't decided yet," he said. Emily laughed. It surprised both of them. The town found out about the marriage by noon the same day, via a mechanism that was never fully identified, but that involved either Dolores Pittman's phone or the courthouse clerk's cousin, who worked at the Bluebird Diner. By dinner, the Heron Falls Gazette had posted a brief article online with the headline, "Beaver Takes Local Bride. Historic Investment Announced." Patrice called Emily to read it to her in a voice of barely contained hilarity. "Beaver takes local bride," Patrice said. "Emily, Beaver takes local bride." "I read the headline, Patrice. Heron Falls residents are buzzing this week as local billionaire Mason Beaver." "Patrice, known affectionately as the Billionaire Beaver, I'm hanging up, has announced both his surprise marriage to elementary school teacher Emily Carter and a major investment package that local officials are calling." Patrice dissolved into laughter. Emily sat on the porch of the Calloway house and watched the river go dark in the evening and decided that whatever this was, she was going to have to find it funny. The alternative was too alarming. Inside, she could hear Mason on the phone, speaking in the flat, precise tone he used for business, and through the kitchen window she could see him standing at the stone counter with a coffee mug, and the lamplight was warm, and the river was dark, and she thought, "I married a stranger. I married him for a town full of people who call him the Billionaire Beaver, and the school roof is going to get fixed." She held on to that last part. The school roof was going to get fixed. Chapter 4. Behind the Reputation. Contrary to every reasonable expectation, living with Mason Beaver was not difficult. It was quiet. Bewilderingly quiet. Mason woke up early, 6 a.m., sometimes earlier, and made coffee, which he left in the carafe for Emily without comment. He worked from a home office in the East Wing, behind a door that was always open unless he was on a call. He cooked dinner 3 nights out of 7, simple things: pasta, grilled fish, something with rice, that were considerably better than Emily had anticipated. He cleaned up after himself. He did not leave things on the floor. He also barely spoke, but Emily was beginning to understand that this wasn't rudeness. It was simply his particular frequency. He spoke when he had something to say. When he didn't, he didn't. This was, Emily reflected, unusual and oddly peaceful for someone who spent her days immersed in the joyful chaos of 8-year-olds. What she learned about Mason Beaver in the first 2 weeks came in pieces. He'd left Heron Falls at 22 after a falling out with his father that no one in town seemed to know the details of, though everyone had a theory. He'd started a small construction crew in Nashville with money he'd saved from summer jobs. Over 15 years, it became one of the largest regional construction companies in the Southeast. He'd sold it, at 40, because he was tired of building things for other people. He read constantly, actual books, which he stacked on every available surface. History, architecture, environmental engineering, the occasional novel that he left face down on the kitchen counter and refused to discuss. He had one friend. His name was Del Santos, and he called from Phoenix every 10 days or so. Emily overheard enough of these conversations to establish that Del was the only person on earth Mason spoke to with anything resembling ease. And he had a dog. She discovered this on day 4, when she came downstairs at 7 in the morning to find Mason sitting at the kitchen table with a large, elderly golden retriever with a gray muzzle and the expression of a dog who has seen everything and judged none of it. "You have a dog," Emily said. "This is Frank," Mason said. Frank looked at Emily with deep philosophical eyes. "Where was Frank before?" Emily asked. "Del was keeping him," Mason said. "He arrived yesterday." Emily sat down. Frank ambled over, put his big gray head on her knee, and sighed the sigh of a creature who has found exactly where he wants to be. "Oh," Emily said softly. "Hello, Frank." She looked up to find Mason watching her with Frank, with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. It was careful and quiet, and contained something she'd have to circle back to. "He likes people," Mason said. "Unlike someone else I know," Emily said. "I like people," Mason said. "I just don't need many of them." "How many do you need?" said. He considered this. "1 or 2, he said. "Good ones." Emily scratched Frank's ears. "That's the saddest answer I've ever heard, Mason." "It's an honest one," he said, and returned to his coffee. She didn't push it, but she thought about it later, standing at the whiteboard in her classroom, explaining the difference between fictional and non-fictional stories to 22 children who were supposed to be paying attention but had caught the word beaver in Emily's new name on the attendance sheet and were experiencing a difficult morning. "Ms. Carter," said Jalen with the precision of a child who has thought carefully about a question. "Is your husband actually a beaver?" "No, Jalen," Emily said. "He is a person. Carl's dad said he might be part beaver. Carl's dad is mistaken. He said he builds dams. He builds other things, bridges, community centers. That's kind of what beavers do," Jalen said thoughtfully. Emily looked at him. "Would you like extra fraction worksheets?" Jalen decided he had no further questions. Chapter 5. Building Something New. The construction on the Riverside district began in July. It was, even for a town accustomed to the beaver's methods, startling in its scale and speed. 30 workers showed up on a Monday morning with equipment, plans, and a project manager named Roz, who wore steel-toed boots and had the organizational energy of a small army. By Wednesday, the most structurally compromised building on the block had been stabilized. By the following week, the scaffolding was up on 4 storefronts. Mason was on site every morning. Emily started stopping by on her way to school, coffee in hand, because it was on her route and because she found, unexpectedly, that watching Mason Beaver in his element was fascinating in the way that certain specific and quietly extraordinary things are fascinating. He walked the site differently than he walked anywhere else. Not looser, exactly, but purposeful in a way that fit him. He spoke to his workers with directness and something that earned, she noticed, a particular kind of respect. Not fear, as the town's reputation suggested, but the respect you give someone who knows what they're doing and is fair about it. "The window frames on the old apothecary building," she said one morning, standing beside him with her travel mug, watching workers remove decades of bad renovations from the facade. "My grandmother used to say they were the original 1887 frames." "They are," he said. "We're keeping them." "You checked?" Roz confirmed it. He pointed. We found the original tin ceiling inside, too. It's in better shape than anyone expected. Emily looked at the building. The bad aluminum cladding was coming off in pieces, revealing the original brick beneath, warm red and cream, the bones of something that had always been beautiful. This is what you actually love, she said, without quite planning to. Mason was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. Not the money, the building. The money makes the building possible, he said. But yes. She thought about the boy who'd grown up here, whose grandfather had built these streets, who'd learned to love construction the way you learn to love something that's in the blood. She thought about what it must be like to have left and spent decades building things for other people's cities and come back. Why did you really come back? She asked. He looked at the river, broad and slow in the summer heat. Because this is the thing worth building, he said. Emily didn't say anything. The morning was quiet except for the sound of workers and the river, and Frank, who had accompanied Mason to the site and was now sitting in the shade of a parked truck, watching everything with his old, wise eyes. For what it's worth, Emily said finally, I think they're going to let you, the town. I think they're going to come around. Mason glanced at her. Dolores Pittman called me the Beaver to my face again yesterday. She does that to everyone she likes. She called Del Whitmore a great lummox for 40 years. He cried at her retirement party. Emily laughed. That's Dolores. It's not the worst nickname I've ever had, Mason said. Emily looked at him. What's the worst nickname you've ever had? He said nothing, which was somehow the most intriguing answer he could have given. Mason, Emily said. Grimm, he said. In college, after the Brothers Grimm. Emily considered this. Because you were Grimm? Because I told a guy in my construction management class that his load-bearing calculations were wrong and his project would collapse, and he said I was like a fairy tale villain, and it stuck. Were his calculations wrong? Catastrophically. Then that's a good nickname, Emily said. I didn't think so at the time. She smiled. Emily said. He was watching her smile, she realized. Not intrusively, but with the focused attention he gave to things he was genuinely trying to understand. The way he looked at a building he was assessing, as if he was learning the structure of something. She turned away before whatever that was could go anywhere she wasn't prepared for. I'll see you tonight, she said, picking up her bag. I'll make dinner, he said. You don't have to do that every night. I know, he said. I want to. She walked towards school. Behind her, Frank got up from the shade, trotted a few paces after her, and then sat down and looked between her and Mason with the patient wisdom of a very old dog who understands things that people are still working out. Chapter 6. Falling by the River. The Heron Falls. Summer Festival had existed, in one form or another, since 1923. It occupied the riverfront for 3 days in late July, with food stalls and local bands and a boat parade and a pie competition that had caused actual disputes between neighbors. Emily had worked the festival committee for 7 years. She had opinions about the pie competition. This year, the festival had a new energy. The Riverside District restoration was visible from the riverfront. Scaffolding and tarps and the promise of something coming back. And people were feeling something that had been missing for a while. Hope was a thing you could feel in a crowd, Emily had always believed. It had a particular warmth. Mason came to the festival. This was, to put it mildly, a significant event. The Billionaire Beaver, at the Heron Falls Summer Festival, walking through the crowd with his wife and his elderly dog, doing what could generously be described as socializing. He was terrible at it, He shook hands too firmly and didn't make small talk, and responded to questions with direct answers that left people slightly startled, because most festival small talk was designed to go nowhere, and Mason's answers had content. Carl Briggs asked him what he thought about the weather, and Mason gave a 2-minute assessment of river flooding patterns and historical precipitation data. "That was informative," Carl said afterward to Emily. "He's thorough," Emily said. "Is he always like that?" "Always," Emily said, with a fondness that surprised her. But Frank was a social triumph. Frank ambled through the festival at Mason's heel, accepting pats and ear scratches with the regal grace of a golden retriever who has decided this is his due, and approximately 12 children attached themselves to Frank within the first hour, and did not detach until their parents collected them at the end of the evening. Mason crouched down to Frank's level to have a small conversation with a 5-year-old named Abby, who had been telling Frank her opinions about the festival for some time, and the expression on Mason's face during this conversation was something Emily stored in a particular place in her chest for later. She was standing at the pie competition table, purely in a monitoring capacity, when she heard Dolores Pittman behind her. "The Beaver's good with kids," Dolores said. "His name is Mason," Emily said automatically. "He's good with kids," Dolores repeated. "I didn't expect that. His father wasn't. Hard man, his father." Emily looked at her. "What happened between Mason and his father?" Dolores was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. "Robert Beaver wanted to sell," she said. "When Mason was young, the whole Riverside district. His father wanted to take the money. Mason said no. They fought about it for years, and when Mason left, Robert sold what he could and drank the money. Years." She paused. "Robert died about 6 years ago, before Mason came back." Emily looked across the festival to where Mason was now standing with a group of the construction workers, looking at something on a phone one of them was showing him. Blueprints, probably, because Mason Beaver at a summer festival was still thinking about load-bearing structures. "He came back to save what his father tried to sell?" Emily said. "That's the shape of it," Dolores agreed. Later, in the blue hour between sunset and dark, Emily found Mason standing at the riverbank, where the festival lights were strung along the dock and reflecting in the water in long gold lines. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," he said. "Dolores told me about your father," she said. He was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. "About him, about what he did." "He made his choices," Mason said. "That doesn't make it not hurt." Mason turned to look at her. In the festival light, the stern lines of his face were softer, and his eyes were dark and serious and held something she recognized. It looked like the feeling of carrying something heavy for a long time. "No," he said. "It doesn't." Without entirely thinking about it, Emily put her hand on his arm. Just that, a small, human gesture. Mason looked down at her hand, and then looked at her, and didn't move away. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For asking," he said. "People don't usually ask." The river moved past them, dark and wide, carrying the reflected lights downstream. Around them, the festival hummed. Frank sat between them and leaned his gray head against Mason's knee. Emily thought, "Oh no," because the feeling that had been building in her chest for weeks had a shape now, and it was not the shape of a business arrangement. Chapter 7. Secrets Behind the Money. The trust administrator arrived in August. His name was Gerald Whitmore, no relation to any local Whitmore, and he was a compact, efficient man from Nashville who arrived in a rental car, wore a suit in August heat without apparent discomfort, and had the eyes of someone who had seen every kind of marital arrangement in a 40-year legal career and was not easily fooled. Emily did not know, until the night before his visit, that the visit was going to be an assessment, an interview, that Gerald Whitmore would want to meet with both of them, separately and together, and that his report to the trust board would determine whether the secondary holding was released. Mason told her this at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, and Emily looked at him with an expression that he accurately read. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry." "What does he ask?" she said. "In these interviews?" "Personal questions?" Mason said. "About the relationship. How we met, how we decided to get married, what our daily life looks like." He looked at the table. "It needs to be consistent, and it needs to sound..." Emily said. "Yes." "Mason," she said, "the problem is that our answers are going to be real. We did meet, we do have a daily life, we have Frank. I know how you take your coffee and you know about the patient." She stopped. He looked at her. "The problem," she said carefully, "I'm not sure what's the arrangement anymore, and what isn't." The kitchen was very quiet. "Emily," he started. "Let me get through tomorrow," she said. "We can talk about the rest after." He nodded. She could see him processing, rearranging, deciding something. "Whatever you need," he said. After. Gerald Whitmore arrived at 9 the next morning. He was, Emily discovered, not unkind. He was thorough. He asked her, in a pleasant and indirect way, many questions that had the structure of simple conversation and the substance of a deposition. How did she and Mason spend their evenings? What had first surprised her about him? What did she find most frustrating about living with him? "He doesn't make small talk," Emily said. "And he tells Carl Briggs about river flooding when Carl just wants to talk about the weather. And he leaves his books face down, and that's bad for the spine of the book, and I've told him, but he keeps doing it." Gerald wrote something in his notebook. "But," Emily said. Gerald looked up. "He leaves coffee for me before I'm awake. He built a garden bed for me last weekend without being asked, because he noticed the soil drainage was wrong. He sits with Frank on the porch every evening and watches the river, and sometimes I sit with them, and it's the most peaceful part of my day." She paused. "With them. He's building back something his father tried to take away from this town, and he doesn't want credit for it, and that's the kind of person he is." Gerald looked at her for a moment. "You're fond of him," he said. "Yes," Emily said. "I am." It was not a lie. That was the part that was becoming difficult to locate. Gerald met with Mason afterward in the study. Emily took Frank for a walk and tried not to spiral, and mostly failed, and came back to find Mason in the kitchen, making coffee with the specific focused energy of a man who needed something to do with his hands. "How did it go?" she asked. "Well, I think," he said. He handed her a mug. "What you said. He told me what you said. About the coffee. The garden bed." "I wasn't going to lie," she said. "Those things are true." "I know," he said. "Emily, you said after?" she reminded him. "Yes," he said. "After." They looked at each other across the kitchen counter, and Frank sat between them again, looking first at one and then the other, with his infinitely patient eyes. "The holding," Emily said. "If it's released. The other towns you mentioned." "3 of them," Mason said. "Similar to Heron Falls. River towns, historic districts, failing infrastructure." "How many more Emilys are you going to have to marry?" she said. He gave her a look. "I'm kidding," she said. "Partially kidding. The arrangement with you was the only option," he said carefully. "I know," Emily said. "I was there for the proposal." "Emily," he said. I want to be honest with you. That's a terrifying way to begin a sentence. The trust, he said, was the reason I came back. But it's not the reason I... He stopped. Set down his coffee mug. Tried again. When I came back here, I thought I was going to do this quickly. An arrangement. Practical. Clean. I didn't expect... He gestured, a small motion, at the kitchen, at Frank, at the space between them that had been shifting for months. Mason, Emily said. I didn't expect you, he said. The kitchen was so quiet, she could hear the river outside. She thought about everything she should say. About contracts, and trust administrators, and 30-day proposals, and paper fish on the wall. She thought about Gerald Whitmore and his notebook. She thought about Dolores Pittman and Carl Briggs, and 22 8-year-olds, and a town that was being built back from the bones up. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him, which was not something she'd planned, and was therefore entirely honest. He was very still for one moment, as if he was learning the structure of something new, and then he kissed her back. Frank made a sound of deep approval and went to his bed. Chapter 8. When the town turns against them. The Gazette article came out on a Thursday. It was not, in the scheme of things, a large article. A local freelance journalist named Marcus Webb, no relation to Patrice, though Patrice had opinions, had done some research into Mason's investment history and had constructed a narrative that was, in its way, coherent and in its way, devastating. The headline was, Beaver Deal. Is Heron Falls a business investment or a tax strategy? The article suggested that Mason's investment in Heron Falls was primarily a tax structuring vehicle. It cited his previous investments in other distressed towns and framed them as real estate acquisitions rather than restoration projects. It quoted two people, unnamed, who questioned the sincerity of the whole arrangement, including the marriage. Emily read it at the kitchen table on Thursday morning. Mason had already read it. She could tell by the particular quality of the silence from his end of the table. Is any of it true? She asked. The investments have tax benefits, he said. All investments have tax benefits. That's not why I'm doing it. What about the other towns? He says they were acquisition projects. I restored them, Mason said. I still own the properties, yes. That's how restoration investment works. You have to have ownership to protect the restoration. Emily looked at the article again. He quotes someone who says the marriage was arranged for legal and financial purposes. The silence was different now. Emily? Mason said. It was arranged, she said. That's true. It was arranged, he said. That's also not the whole truth. She looked up at him. His expression was the most open she'd ever seen it, which was not, by other people's standards, very open at all. But by Mason's, it was. I know, she said. But the town doesn't. She was right that it was bad. By noon, she'd received 4 texts from parents of students expressing concern. By afternoon, the town council had asked for an emergency meeting. By evening, 3 businesses along the Riverside district had reached out to the project manager with questions about the contracts. And Dolores Pittman came to the house. Dolores did not knock. She walked up the porch steps, opened the front door. In Heron Falls, people still did this. Came into the kitchen, sat down across from Mason, and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has known you since before you were a person to be reckoned with. You should talk to them, Dolores said. I'm not going to explain myself to Marcus Webb, Mason said. Not to Marcus Webb, Dolores said. To the town, at the council meeting. You should talk to them the way you talked to Emily. Mason was quiet. I've been watching you for 30 years, Dolores said. I watched you fight your father over these streets when you were 19 years old. I watched you leave when you lost. I watched those buildings get sold and stripped and fall apart. She paused. And I'm watching you put it back. I know what this is, Mason. But they need to hear it from you. Emily looked at Mason. He was looking at Dolores. You're the one who started calling me the Billionaire Beaver, he said. I did, Dolores said, without apology. I'm not a bank to be managed, he said. No, Dolores said. You're a person. Act like one. He stood up from the table. He looked at Emily. Come with me, he said. To the council meeting, she said. Yes. You're asking me to stand in front of the whole town with you. Yes, he said, as my wife. The weight of that word, as he said it, the way he said it, was different from the contract. She noticed. Okay, she said. Let me find my good cardigan. Chapter 9. The Man Nobody Understood. There were approximately 300 people at the emergency town council meeting, which was a significant portion of Heron Falls's adult population, and more people than the community center could comfortably hold, so the overflow stood in the parking lot with the windows open. Mason did not prepare a speech. Emily knew he hadn't prepared a speech because she'd watched him all afternoon, and he hadn't written anything down, or rehearsed anything, or asked for her feedback. And when she gently suggested that some talking points might be useful, he'd said, I know what I want to say, in the flat, certain tone that meant he'd already decided. He stood up in front of 300 people who were waiting, and he said, My grandfather built the ferry dock in 1941. He built 3 of the storefronts on River Street and the original community center that burned down in 1987. He built things because he believed this town was worth building, and I grew up believing the same thing. He was not a natural public speaker in the way that politicians are natural public speakers. He didn't project warmth or ease. He was direct and still and completely sincere, and the room was very quiet. My father wanted to sell it, Mason said. I fought him on it for years. When I lost, I left. I spent 20 years building things for other people because I didn't want to watch what happened here. I came back because I'm done watching. He paused. The investments are real. The restoration contracts are real. Every worker on that site is local. Every material specification preserves original architecture. If you want to call that a tax strategy, fine. Everything legal is a tax strategy. It's also a love letter to a place I should never have left. A sound moved through the room. Not quite words. My wife, Mason said, and looked at Emily, where she was sitting in the front row. Told me 3 weeks after we met that the school roof had to be fixed first, before anything else. He looked back at the room. The roof is fixed. I want you to know that's her doing, not mine. She told me what mattered, and I listened, and I'm going to keep listening, because that's the only way this works. He sat down. The room was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then Dolores Pittman, from 3 rows back, said, That'll do, Beaver. And somewhere in the middle of the room, someone started clapping. Afterward, in the parking lot, under the August stars, Emily stood with Mason while people came and spoke to him. Actually spoke to him, not the way they'd murmured at a distance on River Street, but directly, neighbor to neighbor, the way the town had been practicing for the week when it would finally be ready. Carl Briggs shook his hand and apologized for the weather commentary. Roz, the project manager, appeared from nowhere, declared the speech adequate, and went back to wherever Roz always came from. Jalen's mother introduced herself and said her son had strong opinions about beavers that she hoped weren't causing offense. None at all, Mason said. He thinks you might be able to breathe underwater, Jalen's mother said. I cannot, Mason said. But I appreciate the theory. Emily stood beside him through all of it, close enough that their hands kept finding each other, a thing that had started happening recently in a way that neither of them had commented on, but neither of them had stopped. When the parking lot had mostly cleared, she said, "That was a good speech." "It was honest," he said. "Same thing, sometimes." He looked at her. The parking lot light was harsh and yellow, and he looked in it, she thought, like himself. Not performing anything, not constructing anything, just the person who was there. "Emily," he said. "The trust. Has Gerald made his decision?" "He called this afternoon, before the meeting. He's recommending release." Mason paused. "Which means the arrangement, the legal necessity of the arrangement, is concluded." She looked at him steadily. And, he said, "I want to ask you again." She waited. "Not for a trust fund," he said. "Not for an administrative requirement. Not for anything that has a contract or a term." He looked at her with those serious eyes that had never stopped watching her carefully, learning the structure of her. "Just for me. Because I want to stay married to you, and I understand if that's not what you want. But I needed you to know that the arrangement is over, and the feeling is not." But Emily Carter, who had spent 32 years being optimistic and cheerful and fiercely loyal, who taught children to read and served on the Historical Preservation Committee, and made time for every person who needed her, and occasionally lost her patience with students who asked about beaver anatomy during fraction lessons, stood in a parking lot under yellow light and thought about paperfish on the wall, and coffee left in the carafe, and a garden bed built without being asked, and an old dog named Frank who'd chosen her knee the first morning. "Well," she said, "it would be a shame to change my name again." Mason looked at her. "Emily Beaver," she said. "I've grown accustomed to the sound of it." He laughed. Fully, completely, without reservation. A sound that startled her with how much she'd been waiting for it. That deep, rare, entirely real laugh that she had heard only in glimpses and pieces, and that she intended, she decided, to spend a great deal of time drawing out of him in the years ahead. She kissed him in the parking lot, in the yellow light, with the river audible somewhere in the summer dark. Someone, it might have been Dolores, it was possibly Dolores, cheered. Chapter 10. The Life They Built Together. The Riverside District reopened the following June. 12 storefronts, fully restored. The original brick warm in the summer sun, the 1887 window frames in the apothecary shop gleaming with new glass. The tin ceiling inside so beautiful that when the photographer from a regional magazine came to document the restoration, she stayed for 3 days and cried at the grist mill. The school had a new roof, updated HVAC, and a science lab that Jalen described as the best thing that has ever happened in the history of the world, which Emily felt was appropriate given the circumstances. The ferry dock was rebuilt. The park along the river, which had been a scrubby, unloved strip of nothing for a decade, had been redesigned by a landscape architect from Chattanooga, a friend of Dell's, into something that people actually went to. Paths and benches and native plantings and a small amphitheater where the Heron Falls Summer Concert Series now happened on warm evenings. The Callaway House had 12 rooms, and the East Wing had been converted into meeting rooms that the town used for everything from the Historical Preservation Committee to Dolores Pittman's book club to a weekly craft group that Emily had joined, and Mason had been invited to join and declined, though he occasionally brought them coffee without being asked. Emily was pregnant, though he had 8 weeks, as of Tuesday. She had told Mason on a Sunday morning, sitting on the porch with coffee and Frank, and his expression had moved through something so complex and so open that she'd reached over and held his hand and said, "It's okay to feel a lot of things at once." And he'd said, "I know," in a voice that suggested he was learning that. The summer festival was back in full, bigger than the previous year, and the festival lights were strung along the new dock, and the pie competition was more contentious than ever. Dolores Pittman had entered for the first time in 11 years, which had caused a reorganization of the judges' panel, and the boat parade went down the river at dusk with lanterns, small and bright against the water. Emily stood at the riverbank with Mason, watching the lanterns go, Frank between them. "The other towns," she said. "The 3 you mentioned. When does that start?" "September," he said. "Roz is managing the team for the first one." "September. I'd like to go with you," Emily said. "When you visit." He looked at her. "I'm a teacher," she said. "Every town like ours has kids who need things. I'd like to see what they need." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was feeling something he was still finding words for. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." She leaned against him. He put his arm around her, easy and familiar, the way it had become, the way she didn't think she'd ever fully understood comfort until this particular version of it. "Mason," she said, "what are you building next?" He looked at the river. The lanterns were moving away, small flames on dark water. "This," he said, "just this." Dolores Pittman won the pie competition. She had, she explained to anyone who would listen, been saving her grandmother's recipe for 11 years for exactly the right moment. The right moment, she felt, was a year in which the Riverside district was restored. The school was fixed. The Billionaire Beaver had finally been civilized by a sensible woman, and something was clearly building again. Dolores ate her pie on a bench by the river, with Frank asleep at her feet and the festival loud and warm around her, and watched the last of the lanterns disappear downstream. "Not bad for a beaver," she said, to no one in particular. And the river moved on, wide and slow, carrying the light. And I Married a Billionaire Beaver by Joan Savage.